For more on this story, we're joined by our correspondent, Gulliver Cragg, who's in Kyiv. So, Gulliver, thanks for joining us. Tell us a bit more about the declaration, the draft declaration that we've seen reported in some of the media.
Well, it looks as though the things that Ukraine wanted to have in the declaration and which were at some stage of earlier drafts taken out have been put back in a way. The declaration mentions Russia's war against Ukraine. Originally, the Ukrainians wanted Russia's aggression against Ukraine, so it's watered down somewhat, but it's still there. It also makes clear that the basis for what the delegates think should be moves towards trying to achieve peace going forward should be Ukraine's peace formula, which is the 10-point plan set out by Volodymyr Zelensky at the end of 2022, and which states that Russian forces should leave Ukraine. But the declaration also says, and other formulas in adherence to international law. Now, international law, of course, implies the respect of state sovereignty and territorial integrity. That's also mentioned, but in reasonably vague terms. I think the Ukrainians are hoping reasonably enough for the countries that are, as it were, the doubters to still sign up to it. We'll see whether or not they do. Further down the declaration, there are more concrete matters, including the need for Ukraine to re-establish its sovereignty over the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, which is currently deactivated under Russian occupation and a source of great concern to the world. So I think the Ukrainians are going to be able to say that this summit is at least a partial success. It's not the huge success that they really wanted it to be, in which they were hoping to show Russia, as it were, isolated by having a slightly larger number of countries and, most importantly, having China on board, at least to some degree. But importantly, at the last minute, the Saudis did send their foreign minister, though what he said, Faisal bin Rahman, said that the Ukrainians ought to plan for Russia to be at future talks and that compromises were necessary. There were a few other delegates who were talking about the need for compromise. These were all delegates from the global south. The European leaders, Ursula von der Leyen, for example, also the Croatian Prime Minister and most European leaders had much stronger language in terms of absolutely roundly condemning Russia, including the most recent statements by Vladimir Putin, which were basically that he wasn't prepared to open any talks with Ukraine until Ukraine agreed to give up vast swathes of more territory.
And what's Ukraine's strategy then overall on the diplomatic front at this point in the war?
Well, I think the task for Volodymyr Zelensky really is to convince the world that it's possible for Ukraine to turn things around on the battlefield, because to varying degrees, people are, of course, starting to doubt. The front line is stagnating. The Russians have been on the attack for the whole of this year so far, and they're expected to continue to be on the attack until the end of 2024. The results of those battles will be very determining for what happens in 2025 and how much pressure can be put on Ukraine to sit down at the negotiating table and make some concessions. Ukraine clearly saw this summit as a way to get as many countries as possible on board to its peace formula and to convince them that, Russia could not be expected to do anything reasonable. Other countries that came, I think to some degree, including the hosts, Switzerland, saw it as an opportunity to try to persuade the Ukrainians to sit down and start to be prepared to make some concessions to Russia. So, it's really a case of Ukraine trying to convince the world that it can still do it, that it can still, stake out its claim that it can, defend its territorial integrity.